Um, this is our last excuse me. This is our last week for this quarter. Next quarter, starting next Sunday, Butch will be teaching biblical financial plan. I think I change the name of the class every week. Something about your money in the Bible. That's basically what it's going to be about. Planning your finances from a biblical perspective. There's a new name for the class. But today we're going to finish up this quarter on creating Christian character. Last week we talked about living lives that are captivated, that trying to get past that we just have to do this to the point where we're living on a why, that we're motivated by what God did for us, by what we see that God offered us, what we see that Jesus did for us. But it was pointed out, I was talking to Adam during the week, and the fact is sometimes that obedience has to be the motivation, because, and we kind of talked about that some last week, that if your motivation is an emotion or a feeling or a fabricated thing, it's going to collapse on you. So every now and then that motivation has to be, I just need to do what's right. But even at that, we can look through Scripture, and when we talked last week about some of the people who, even in difficult times, Jesus and Paul in particular, were obedient and were enthralled in the life that they were living, even in Jesus in the garden, Paul in prison, even in difficult situations. But sometimes, like I said, if your motivation to serve is this feels good or it makes me happy, well, sometimes it's not going to feel good or make you happy. So your motivation has to be a little bit different to live that life that's captivated for Christ. So today we're going to talk about conflict and conflict resolution. Now, to be completely honest, this topic could be a quarter in and of itself. In fact, what we're going to do today is a condensing of about 6 lessons in a whole course on conflict resolution. But it's what I want to do is go through some kind of lay a foundation of how do we look at conflict, and then I guess kind of 4 aspects of how we should approach dealing with conflict. And then I want to get through that, and I want to get through these 6 lessons in kind of a hurry, which seems impossible. But then I want to talk about some things that we have coming up for this young adult, young families group, some things that we can add to our calendar, and et cetera, et cetera. But first, let's deal with actually first, ask John if he would lead us in a prayer. Do we have any prayer requests this morning?
Just my sister's boyfriend, Hunter.
Mm-hmm. How's that going?
He had one Bible study, and then he listened to a podcast that we recommended, and he's going to make time for another Bible study, so he's not completely shut the door. So that's awesome.
Baby steps. Yep. Very good.
Yeah.
I don't have his last name, but Audrey's uncle was on the prayer list. Will get stage 4 cancer, and they took him off the ventilator, so he's going to pass away today or tomorrow.
Mm.
They actually waited because yesterday was his dad's death. As far as the day his dad died,
Oh, wow.
they waited at least until the next day. Young family. He's 56, something like that, 57, so kind of reminds me of Arnie alive.
Yeah.
So young kids. So just Uncle Will, or Aubie's uncle, and the comfort. She's gonna fly down to California next week and be there. So safe travels. Sure.
Our friend Elise, who's on the prayer list already.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah. She is going home. They still don't know what was wrong. Her finger finally broke, but they had to do a liver biopsy and a few other things, and so they don't know what was wrong, but she's doing better than she was, so she might get to go home soon, but they're still going to be watching her really close.
So Patterson's friend Elise still hospitalized, I guess, yeah, but improving.
Trying to figure stuff out.
Yeah, man, that's what's tough when you're in the hospital and they're like, don't know what this is.
Yeah.
What else?
My coworker passed away unexpectedly. So today is just pray for the Jeffers family.
Jeffers?
Yeah, Mark Jeffers.
That's tough. Well, just a praise prayer, I guess. It was announced last Sunday, I guess, that Dina Myers, Michelle Kish's mom, Joe Myers' mom, Paul and Dina, most of you. Dina had something in her eye that they thought was going to be a melanoma, I think. Turns out it wasn't. They announced that Wednesday night. I don't know if you were here or not Wednesday night. Turns out it's not. They're just going to monitor it, and things have. There's a sigh of relief in the Myers family. So it's just something that they're going to keep an eye on, but it's not. It wasn't cancerous. So that was good news. And Brandon and Katana are a Mr. and Mrs. now. Off somewhere, Mr. and Mrs.ing. So just prayer for them as they start their new life, and kind of exciting. These kids these days.
Did you do the ceremony?
Yes, theoretically. Anything else? All right, John, if you would.
Dear Lord, we're glad together again as the church. We thank you again for bringing us together through our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. We're looking forward to worshiping you in the next hour. We pray that we would be awake and energized and focused on bringing you worship. And excited now for this hour to study your word and to encourage each other in how to deal with conflict. Lord, at this time we also want to bring some prayer requests before you. We want to pray for Risha's sister's boyfriend. That's Jessica's boyfriend, Hunter. That you would bless him as he's looking into your word. You would guide him, incline his heart, and be with those that are around him, that they can encourage him in your truth, Lord, and towards knowing you and your Son Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Lord, there are a lot of people right now who are undergoing difficulties, losing loved ones, cancer or other diseases. We just pray right now your comfort upon Aubrey's uncle's family, Uncle Will, as he's passing away. We pray that passing would be eased, and that you would comfort that family and all those who are going to be traveling, including Aubrey as they go to California to mourn his passing. But I also pray for the family of Norca's co-worker that passed away, for the Jeffers family, Lord, we pray your comfort upon that family. Lord, we're glad to hear that the Patterson's friend Elise is doing better, and we pray you continue to be with the doctors and those that are watching over her, that they could try to figure out what's going on, but that there wouldn't be any follow-up issues. And we're also grateful, Lord, that Dina Myers doesn't have cancer in the eye, and just very grateful for that family as well. Lord, I'm glad that Brandon and Katana were married yesterday, and pray that you would bless their union. Pray that you would also be with everyone who traveled here for the wedding, and give them safe travels home, and may they continue to enjoy their time here and visit as well. Thank you again, Lord, for bringing us together in this family through Jesus Christ, and it's in his name we pray.
Amen. Yeah, I meant to mention all the travelers here. I forgot. I forgot you. You're sitting right in front of me. Travis, would you just pull that door closed a little bit to the construction project back there? That's what it sounds like. Ready for a jackhammer to start. Okay, so let's play word association, thought association, conflict. What do you think of? Fighting, what? Resolution, the positive side. What else? Huh? Conflict, what comes to mind? Opposition, what? Time. Yeah, time. We have conflicts in our time. What else? Arguments. Confrontation. What? Pride, sources of conflict. Usually when we think of conflict, and that's the way we go, is we think of negative. I mean, because that's kind of the way we think of it. What I want us to kind of think about this morning, and this is maybe a spin, I'll admit that, but I want us to kind of look at how we can make even conflict positive in some ways. how we can find the positive in conflict. Are we going to avoid conflict? No, unless you're a monk that's locked in your particular room in the, what's it called, monastery, then you're going to have conflict. It's going to be at home. It's going to be at work. You're going to deal with conflict as long as you express an opinion about the world, you're going to deal with conflict. Look over to Proverbs chapter 3. And this is kind of what I want to be our foundation as we deal with thinking about conflict. And like I said, what I want us to do kind of is think from overall, kind of from a church perspective. How do we deal with each other in a congregation? How do we deal with our church family? But these same principles apply as we narrow it down to our, extended family, immediate family, spouse, best friends, whatever. But when we find ourselves in a situation where there's conflict, it's very easy for us to think, what am I doing with these people? Why am I wasting my time with these people? How did I ever get myself in this situation? And, we'll get to that in a minute. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways know him, and he will make your paths straight. When we deal with conflict, and we'll come back to this again, but our objective, and really in everything about our lives, but in times of conflict, we have to remember to trust in God. Trust in God, trust in his word, trust in his ways, and then follow those ways. It's easy to say, I trust God, and then you find yourself in a conflict, and you go, but I'm not going to do any of that Bible stuff. I'm going to punch this guy in the face, or whatever. I'm going to do what makes me get through this conflict the easiest. As Christians, okay, here's your chance. Here's your chance for the Bible class answer. As Christians, how are we supposed to deal with conflict? Peer pressure. How are we supposed to deal with conflict? Patience.
I could obviously apply to any situation, but definitely in the church, because especially if it's dealing with different points of view or different interpretations of scripture, sometimes you just have to be patient and then figure things out.
Patience, because everybody's going to have a different perspective, basically. What else? Turn the other cheek. That's a Bible answer. Absolutely. That's right. What else? When it comes to, here's exactly theoretically how we should deal with conflict.
With the whip turning over tables?
In some ways, yes. Adam said with a whip turning over tables. And now, great, one of my points is to be Christ-like, so I have to accept that answer.
Just practicing a lot of self-control as far as like your emotions go and how you're dealing with the situation in terms of communicating with the other person.
Yeah, with self-control, realizing that, you got to have that moment of just take a deep breath, now deal with the situation. Shrewd as serpent, innocent as doves. Absolutely. And there's some of that there's some truth to that, especially when it comes to conflict.
I think we're given a couple of different examples based on whether we're dealing with someone in the church or someone outside.
Absolutely. Well, Brad said we have some examples how we're dealing with somebody in the church or someone outside. In fact, that's where we'll end up. John.
There's a lot of Romans 12 that comes to mind, right? Like not avenging yourself or living peacefully with all people.
Absolutely. John jumps ahead. Yes, there is some of that, and we'll absolutely get to that. When we think about what this verse says, and I used this end of verse 2 because I love this expression, bearing with one. What does that mean? Persevering? When you bear with somebody, what does that mean? Put up with their stuff, exactly. When you think of the term bear with somebody, that doesn't mean you're hugging on them and just loving them because they're so neat. It means you're just going, yeah, okay, I can do this. I can get through with this. Because we're going to bear with each other in love, not in anger and gritting your teeth. Don't take that. Bear with one another, making every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. That's how we're called to deal with conflict. That's very different than a lot, if not all, of the world around us. I mean, conflict in our culture is do what's best for you, come out on top, figure out a way to get what's yours. We're called to do whatever we can to bear with each other in love and keep the peace, keep unity. When you think about, in fact, if you go on through the end of this whole thought here in Ephesians 4, Paul ends with the idea that we're supposed to forgive others as God through Christ has forgiven us. I mean, when you put all of that together and put it in the terms of conflict, let's say John and I have an argument and it's a real serious thing, but I'm really mad at him, he's really mad at me, and then I go to these verses, then I'm called to go, okay, we have to figure out a way to work this out. Whereas, a lot of the world around us just goes, okay, I'm not going to talk to him until like 2045, and maybe we'll be over this. I'm going to ignore him and move on. Think about some of these things, some of these descriptions in Scripture that we're called to do as Christians. And really, everybody would be better off if, in utopia, everybody would be better off if we practice these things. We're called to do it. This is how we're to live. We're supposed to keep very short records of when people wrong us. Ephesians 4:26, don't let the sun go down in your anger. In other words, resolve things. It goes back to that idea of resolution. Take responsibility for our contribution to whatever the conflict may be. And we'll talk about that some more in a minute. That's Matthew 7. Take the splinter out of your own eye, which I think I have in mind right now. Matthew 18. Go and show your brother his fault. I mean, that's something we're told to do, not just harbor resentment and say, I'm never talking to that person again. That means you go to them and say, we got to work this out. Here's how I feel about what's happened with us. And then seek reconciliation. Again, Matthew 5:23 and 24. The way that we're to deal with conflict is challenging. It's bigger. I don't know, maybe that's not the right word. It demands that we don't just avoid it. I mean, there's a lot of people, I mean, you hear people talk all the time. He's one of those people who just really likes to avoid conflict. Well, we all like to avoid conflict. Nobody goes looking for, I mean, some people might, but most people don't go looking for conflict. But we're, as Christians, we're called to really develop this Christian character that is ideal. We're told when there is conflict, we have to deal with some sort of confrontation, not in a negative way necessarily. Oh.
Yeah, I'm jumping right into application. Sorry.
Here's your opportunity. Let me ask you this. We talk about this idea, and here's how we're going to break this down for the next few minutes. We need to glorify God in conflict. We need to edify the other person in conflict. That just doesn't even sound possible. And we're to reflect Christ in conflict. How do we do that? How is that possible in conflict, to glorify God, reflect Christ, and edify the other person?
Well, I think of when I think of conflict, 1 Corinthians, and then, of course, you got the idea of here's the fruits of the Spirit, here's the fruits of the flesh. Malice, anger,
Mm-hmm.
fruits of the Spirit, patience, love, joy, peace, long-suffering, not keeping a record of wrongs.
Yeah.
So it's going back to this verse right here. It says the unity of the Spirit. What do we all have in common? We have this basically roadmap of this is exactly what you demonstrate these things. You are living by the Spirit.
Yeah, we all have the same foundation. We all have the same principles. It's just a matter of making the application. Hang on, Adam.
The desire for a resolution to conflict, for me, typically leads me to be the first one to apologize and find the fault and say, hey, here's how I contributed to the situation. I'm really sorry. How can we resolve this? And oftentimes when I apologize with the expectation for the other person to say, well, they better apologize for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
That never ends well.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got to go. You got to go into the situation with, here's what I did wrong, and I just need to apologize for my part of it. And so long as I've been honest with them about my fault in it, I'm good. If they want to apologize for that, then that's
Yeah, what Adam's saying is that we sometimes, and I'll say we because I'm with him, that we sometimes go into the apology of saying, okay, well, I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry, John, that we had this argument, and I really didn't mean to do that. I shouldn't have let pride get in my way. You know, I mean, that's kind of how. So, pony up the apology to me. I mean that, and that's what Adam's saying is that if that's our intention, then we're still not resolving anything.
This isn't like get rid of the conflict, but it could definitely make it much less. Like I think you're already on the right track if you really keep track of the things you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
Like it might be really easy to, whenever you see conflict or whenever it's happening, just to immediately explode with angry words and stuff like that, and emotion-filled words.
Yeah.
But I think you're already on the right track of handling conflict, even if it's not the resolution to the conflict, as long as you just speak peaceably.
Yeah, just keeping a level tone. In fact, we'll get to that in just a minute too. But it's the idea of trying to keep the peace, even if it's in the words you use, the tone of voice. All those things are going to matter. Look over to 1 Corinthians 10. As we look at some of these general principles that we can apply in our approach to conflict, I think one of the things, and again, this is Christian utopia I'm talking about. This is something that it is so much easier said than done. But what we have to try and remember is that we can see even our conflicts, and maybe it's easier said in a broader church family type picture than it is at home, husband, wife, brother, sister, whatever. But we can see conflict even as an opportunity. 1 Corinthians 10, somebody read verse 31. This is one of those verses, you can parallel this with Colossians 3:17, several other verses. Somebody have 1 Corinthians 10:31, please.
Whether then you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God.
Whatever you do, whatever it is, do it to the glory of God. Colossians 3:17, whatever you do in word or do all in the name of the Lord. Do everything you do with the idea that you're doing this in front of God, before God, in a way to honor God. Keep your finger there at 1 Corinthians 10. We'll come back to that. This idea of fight or flight, what does that mean?
Fight or you run.
Okay, when?
When you feel threatened or in danger.
When you feel threatened or in danger. When you're in, we walk through Settlers Park. When you're walking through a park and a squirrel squirrel's over here, and you walk toward it, what does it usually do? Run away. When you're in Rocky Mountain National Park and chipmunks are in your path and you walk near them, what do? They stand there like this. They have no fear whatsoever. You owe them something because you're in their area for some reason. Deer, when you see a deer on a path, you step on a stick, deer's gone. Have anybody ever been around, you're Mr. Texas, have you ever been around like wild boars, wild hogs in Texas? If you cross the path of a wild hog, what's going to happen? Yeah, you could possibly die. And they don't think, oh, there's a noise, I better run away. They think there's a noise, I should trample it. I mean, it's a different mentality. When it comes to us, when we deal with conflict, these are usually our two options. When we get our feelings hurt, it's very easy for us to tend to get angry, tend to get aggressive, tend to want to be assertive, and show that what you just did to me makes me angry. I'm going to bow up and we're going to throw down about this. Or we go, oh, that person said something mean, I'm going to avoid them for the next several years. And it's that middle ground that we have to figure out a way to work with, because avoiding people forever doesn't resolve anything. And then escalating the situation into a terrible fight obviously doesn't do anything. When we think about the way that we're as Christians called to approach conflict, how are we to think about others, just in general? Think of others as higher than ourselves. Think more about what that person feels than what I want. Now, again, honestly, wouldn't that solve everything? I mean, when it comes to conflict, when it comes to, problems in our marriages, problems in our families, problems in our friendships, co-work, if we just said, I care more about what that person feels and thinks than what I want, everything would be solved. But instead, we're humans, and we tend to not do that. Continue there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. When we think about conflict, what we have to, I guess the mentality we have to develop is that if I'm in this conflict with John, it isn't automatically a bad thing. We have to be logical and reasonable enough to go, okay, we disagree. Now, let's figure out how we can work this out. Continuing on there from verse 31. Do the glory of God. Give no offense to Jews or Greeks or the church of God, just as I also try to please everyone in everything, not seeking my own benefit, but the benefit of many, so that they may be saved. Imitate me as I also imitate Christ. I mean, isn't that conflict resolution in a nutshell? I don't want what's best for me. I want what's best for everybody because I want to bring people to Christ, and I want to be just like Christ in the way I deal with conflict. Theoretically, yes, but when we think about what conflict can provide or the opportunities it can provide, just based on what Paul writes in those 3 or 4 verses, number one thing that we need to remember is in this somehow we can glorify God. And we talked about that just briefly, that it may be the fact that I don't blow up, I say the right things, I handle myself gracefully. If it's a coworker, your other coworkers see, hey, that guy knows how to handle himself. That's the Christian guy. That's really cool. If it's in your homes, it's parents, your kids see conflict handled well. If it's extended family, the rest of the family gets to see that you as the professed Christian are handling things correctly. And again, this is really the hardest part about all of this, in my opinion, is even in that conflict, if you figure out a way to work this out between the two of you, you're actually serving the other person. You're, again, like Paul says, you're putting that person's interests above yours. You're making them more important than yourself. And then again, it's the idea of growing to be Christ-like, growing to be that forgiving, as the one who hung on the cross and watched people gambling for his clothes and said, "Forgive them; they don't know what they're doing." I mean, that's a high standard for us. But it's what we're called to be, even in these times of conflict. So let me ask you this. Let's say you're in a conflict, whether it's husband, wife, whether it's friends, whatever it is. How does handling it the right way help you to grow to be like Christ?
I'll try to make this brief, but I had a conflict recently where, not recently, but where I got involved with a volleyball group that was really, really good. And so they kept it almost like perfection, so to speak. They all play like regularly throughout the year, and I'm kind of that person who shows up on a day and jumps in. And I had a guy just totally give me the hardest time ever. And there was that moment where I was like, well, I don't want to seem weak. And so I kind of wanted to lash out and kind of respond with like, hey, listen, this is my first
Yeah.
day back, give me a chance or something. But said that it was with love that I responded. And in fact, I even found ways to go, yeah, teach me. What am I doing wrong? How do you think my hand is twisted a little bit weird? I need to
That's hard, huh?
this way. It was hard at first, but with love, and I kept doing it. I actually saw how frustrated he was and how relaxed I was.
Yeah.
And people saw that as well. And I just felt like just absolute peace as far as that situation. And I was actually seeing an opportunity to, and then later he actually, apologized to me and actually said like, you're a Christian, aren't you? I can just tell. I mean, the tattoo kind of gives away too, but anyway, he actually brought that up later privately, that he was impressed by how I responded. He goes, I was being a jerk. I know I was.
Well, and then you handle that situation correctly then, the next time, is it going to be easier?
Oh, yeah.
Theoretically, I mean, it should be.
Now you have a standard you have to hold.
Yeah. So when you think of growth, you think of physical growth. Say you're wanting to grow muscles. How do you grow muscle? You work them, right? So to grow to be like Christ, we have to do that stuff. I mean, you're not going to grow to be like Christ without some experience, without some experiential growth. I mean, it's easy. I mean, sounds bad. It's kind of easy to read your Bible and to get all that stuff in your head. I'm supposed to love my neighbor as myself. I'm supposed to forgive as Christ forgave me. But then once you do it, that's when you begin to grow. So we can, in an ideal situation, we should grow to the point where we see even conflict as opportunities for us to work our spiritual muscles, I guess would be a way to say it. A way for us to grow and to develop Christ-likeness. So there's opportunity in conflict. But back to kind of what Adam was saying, what we kind of talked about a little bit, the first thing we have to deal with, look over Matthew chapter 7. This is one of those very challenging passages Jesus says here. In this context, first few verses of not don't judge, but don't judge harshly. Yes, it says do not judge, but it says don't judge harshly because that's how you're going to be judged. And you get down to verse 5. Well, look at verse 4. How can you say to your brother, let me take the splinter out of your eye, and look, there's a beam of wood in your own eye? Hypocrite, first take the beam of wood out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to take the splinter out of your brother's eye. First thing that we have to deal with in conflict is we have to get the log out of our eye. I mean, we have to be willing to get, to honestly say, here's what I've done. You know, in this conflict, I know I was a jerk about it. I know I kind of exaggerated your point. I know I kind of did it. Here's what I did wrong. Now let's work on this. And that is, I mean, that's the hardest thing to do is say, here's where I was wrong. Here's what I did that was stupid. I'm sorry about that. Now let's move on. Now, as we'll see as we progress through this, I mean, that's what Jesus says. The next step is then I say, but here's what happened from my perspective from you, so let's work on that too. But first, you have to get your own situation squared up. Have you ever been in this situation where you decide that, let's say you decide you want to buy a car, and you go looking, you look around, and you decide that you want a Jeep Patriot, and you're like, nobody has those. That's kind of cool. I'll have a unique car. And then what happens the next day? There's 40 zillion of them on the road. There wasn't yesterday. Everybody went and bought them the same day you decided to buy yours, right? But that's how our brains work. When we get focused on something, all we see is that. I mean, you're driving through, there's my car, there's my car, there's my car. And it's like, that's how we work. That's the exact same way it is in conflict. That if, again, I'm still mad at John, we have this thing, well then, we might even talk about it, but I'm going to leave, and all I'm thinking about is what he did to me. Here's how I see that. Well, maybe next time I'm going to tell him this. If he says that again, I'm going to bring this up. Because that's how our brain works. We get so caught up in that this is the thing I'm focused on that it's hard to do this. It's hard to go, okay, wait. I've got to get this. I've got to take care of my end of this before I then turn around and tell him his problem. Because that's next. I mean, that's the next step in all of this. When we look at ourselves, we have to look for a couple of different things. Are we people who are prone to look at the negative? I mean, anybody willing to want to say that's who they are? That when you're in a conflict with somebody, you look at the negative. I think that's kind of me. I'll admit that. That it's like, well, I did this wrong, but man, they did this and this and this. And you kind of tend to have more of a negative focus. And another thing is this conflict really stirring up old emotions about some old incident? Maybe not even with that person. Sorry, it's just you over and over. I mean, maybe it's John said something to me that hurt my feelings, but it reminded me of something my sister used to say to me all the time. And I hate them both now. I'm mad at both of them for it. So we have to, when we look at ourselves in our conflict, we have to assess why we're upset about the situation. I mean, we have to be honest with ourselves, and make sure what we're upset about is really the issue. It's not some other thing. I was telling some people recently that I have a friend that preaches in East somewhere, and his congregation is going through a split almost, and this is kind of it's one of those jokes we make, but it's literally over the color of the carpet. But it's not, I mean, that was the tip of the iceberg, and that's why these two different factions got all upset. It goes down to years and years of anger between a couple of different groups of people. But we have to determine that for the conflict with husband, wife, whoever it is. Am I really mad because when I was telling John why I was upset that he looked at his watch? I mean, is that what really made me angry? Or is it because I have a history of my wife, my parents, my siblings? Anytime I try and talk, people ignored me. I mean, figure out what the root is or what the real issue is, and then deal with it appropriately. Okay, now that's tough, but this is where really this is where it even gets more challenging. Matthew 18:15. Jesus says, if your brother sins against you, stay mad at him for a long time, and hopefully you'll both get over it. Go and rebuke him in private. If he listens to you, you have won your brother. See, this is that whole, I really want to avoid confrontation. Jesus says you can't. If there's an issue, you can't just let it fester and ignore it and hope someday you'll both get over it. You have to go talk to him. You have to go talk to your brother. You go talk to your sister. That whatever this is about, go and deal with it. Go and figure out a way to make tomorrow at least a little bit better. So how do we do this? This is dealing with our own faults is tough. Like I said, that it's hard for us to admit I was wrong about that. To me, this step is maybe the more challenging. So just some practical ideas. Pray for humility. Pray that you'll be able, when you go and talk to the person, do this all beforehand, obviously. That you'll be able to accept the fact that you had a part in this. That maybe there's some guilt, maybe there's some blame that you need to accept. So pray for some humility. Going back to what Blake said, plan out what you're going to say. Think about, it sounds terrible, but maybe even write some things down. If you're going to go sit down with a brother you got a bad situation, maybe have a script even, and just say, here, listen, I wrote this down because I wanted to think clearly. Here's what I really want to say. Plan it out. And Proverbs 12:18 talks about using the correct word, using our words rightly. So plan out even what you have to say. Don't just go and say, all right, I'm going to be mad at Brad now. I'm going to go confront Brad. I don't know what I'm going to say, but man, when I get there, I'm going to cut loose on him. Because that always ends well, right? So you don't want to do that. Then anticipate bad reactions, because it's going to happen. Not always and not for everybody, but be mentally prepared that when you say, okay, I'm sorry, I know I did this. I know I was a little insulting when we had this discussion, but I want to tell you I'm sorry about that, but I also didn't like the way that you told me I was an idiot. Well, then you might expect that person to go, I didn't say that. Be ready for the fact that you might get a negative reaction. Choose the right time and place. If somebody just gets home from work, if you have a conflict with your spouse, they just come home from work, just had a bad day, that might not be the time to go, all right, here it is. Because then they're like, wait, give me a minute. When they first wake up in the morning, might not be the best time to do it. Just use some wisdom, use some common sense. Avoid texting or emailing. This wouldn't have been on this list 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but it is now. Don't try and solve your conflicts via text. I mean, if you're like me, you'll tell somebody, I just want to tell you how sorry I am, and it's going to come out. I want to tell you how soft you are. I mean, make sure you're find a time and a place to have the actual face-to-face discussion. This is hard. Assume the best about the person. Don't go in, I mean, yes, you have to anticipate negative reactions, but also assume that this person has some sense too. Go in thinking, we're going to discuss this, we're going to work this out, everything's going to be fine. And then, going back to the first passage we read, you have to trust God. God's the one that gives us all these instructions. God's the one who tells us to put others in front of us. God's the one who tells us to take the beam out of your own eye so you can help your brother with their speck. He's the one that tells you to do all this stuff. Trust Him. Trust that doing it His way will lead to a resolution that works for both of you. Then the sad thing about it is that Matthew 18:16 does tell us that if it might not work. Start with humility, handle the situation right. If it doesn't work, then Matthew 18:16 says take somebody else with you. Not to build a coalition against the person. It isn't to say, look, these people agree with me too. You are a jerk. That's not the point. It's sorry, it's Brad I'm mad at now. But it's to say, listen, we all want to talk about this, and I've told them that that we've tried to work this out. Let's keep trying to work it out. And then verse 17 even says, if that doesn't work, you take it to the church. When we say take it to the church, what do we usually think? Go up front, yeah. Go to the elders. And that's what I usually think. I think, well, then you got to go to the. But sometimes it's get some other people close to that person and just say, I mean, we're the church too. I mean, we didn't have to be that. Oh man. So yeah. After you take those steps, it may get to the point where you have to bring some other people into it. But again, never in there does it say, well, just quit and ignore the person for the next couple years. I mean, we can't do that.
But aren't there still sometimes we got to let it go because you can't control someone else.
Yeah.
Right? On the flip side.
Yeah, and again, that is the point where I guess to a degree you do have to ignore the other person. But even that, you have to do it in the right way. And that, like I said, that's where we could spend a whole lot of time. That whole treat him as a tax collector and a sinner. I mean, we take that to mean we totally isolate them and ignore them. What did Jesus do with tax collectors and sinners? He loved them. So what it means is that we don't have a social relationship with them because we can't. But when we're around them, if we have to be around them, we figure out a way to continue to try and resolve this thing. Okay, so again, the negative reactions. Let me pound through this real quick. Control our tongue. Again, kind of what Blake was saying. Seek godly advisors. If you're not sure how to deal with the situation, ask somebody. Go to an elder. Go to somebody with some more wisdom and experience. Keep doing the right thing. 1 Peter 2:12 says, represent yourselves right so the people in the world around you go, like what Nathan was saying. This person handled things correctly. Recognize our own limits. We're going to do the best we can, but we're not going to always solve things. And then just practice love. I mean, that's what it comes. Like I said, really what it comes down to with all this stuff is be loving toward people. Put other people ahead of yourselves, even in a time of conflict. Okay. So any other thoughts in the next 12 seconds?
Well, like my position at work, sometimes I have to point out people's wrongdoings if it's affecting either other people or causing the company not to meet their objectives. So one way that I found to use that over is admit what you're working on, admit your own faults. Because you say, hey, I found this spec and it's affecting this person, but I'm also working on this log in my life that I'm trying to do that similar, and I'm trying to work through that. So let's work together.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even in a work situation, you can say, here's what the situation is. I've got some claim to it, but here's how we can work it all out.
I hate this class because I really need to work on this. I'm mad that this is it because I have a lot of conflict resolution that I need to work on and I need help.
Well,
It's really hard.
I'll just tell you that in next year we will probably do a quarter on this. because it's giant. And I'll tell you this too. Should probably turn the mic off. When Karen and I were in our young adults class in Oklahoma, when we first got married, we did a whole quarter on conflict resolution, and our preacher taught it. And then it was like a year later, we all had babies, and Bill was like, "I think I overtaught that." I'll just leave that there. Okay, well, we have to be done. I'll email you all the rest of this stuff I want to talk about.